Here at the Independence Reformed Bible Church, we do allow for questions following the service. We do have a microphone. I'll come back in front to take the question. We're getting our sound equipment is in a minor transition. Another way of saying that the microphone doesn't work. So we have a mic that will come around. So raise your hand, and I'll take your question in the front, and then I have to come back up to the mic to answer it.
When the lawyer, when the lawyer is asking, "Who is my neighbor?" it sounds like Jesus is telling him, "Your enemy is your neighbor," because the lawyer, they hate Samaritans. So when you always say your neighbor is those closest to you, it's Christians, but here it doesn't sound like he's saying that. Is he saying that? Who is the Samaritan in this case?
They hated the Samaritans with good reason. Am I saying they had a right to hate them? In a human sense, yeah, they did. Talk about that very briefly. When the Jews, as opposed to the children of Israel, they began to be called Jews, if you will, because the 10 northern tribes had been carried away by the Assyrians, and they were just gone. They were a goner. But what was left was the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. At that point, they began to be called Jews. In some other languages, I believe German, for example, Jews is still Juden, if you will. Is that right? Yeah. Judah, if you will. They were carried off, and for 70 years they were gone. But what happened was Nebuchadnezzar left the losers back in the land. Those losers were further made to be worse losers because Nebuchadnezzar populated the land with foreigners. So picture the ones he left back, the ones to be no threat to him at all. They would be the ones that didn't go to the dentist, had serious lacking personal hygiene. The people that were just so bad, Nebuchadnezzar didn't even worry about them. And then to make it worse, then they intermarry with foreigners. So when the Jews come back 70 years later, guess what they have to deal with? These disgusting Samaritans. And they hated their guts. So they had a reason to hate them. But it wasn't a good reason. It was more like an excuse. Now, the parable of the Good Samaritan, of course, is doing something beyond just loving it is certainly loving your enemy, and they were definitely enemies. Christ, of course, is going beyond saying loving your neighbor, loving your enemy, and if your neighbor happens to be your enemy, then the love your neighbor thing kicks in. Because what they were saying is, and we see this back in the Sermon on the Mount, you might recall that Christ said, "You have heard that it has been said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." I don't know if you recall that from the Sermon on the Mount. And Christ here, is straightening that out in Luke chapter 10. Because if your enemy, not the person who's trying to kill you, it's not what it's talking about, but your personal enemy, the person you don't like, happens to be your neighbor, you love even that person. So what he's doing is he's saying, listen, if you meet your enemy, you need to love him because he's your neighbor at that point. He's a person who needs your help. He's that close to you. And of course, he was that close at that time. He's going right by. There's a guy half dead. He can put him on his donkey. He takes him to an inn to be fixed up. Then that would mean he's using the extreme case. Then anyone in between is certainly your neighbor. At that point, it's not limited to Christians. It starts there, but it doesn't end there. It's not limited to your family. Yes, charity begins at the house of God, but it doesn't end there. A lot more could be said about that. That's what I love about these questions. We never really get to the end of them. And you'd be surprised how often I'm driving home and saying, wish you would have said more.
Okay, so we've established we're to love our enemies. All right.
Yes, our enemies.
Okay, well, where there's prayers against the wicked, there's imprecatory prayers that go up. How do you reconcile that?
Thank you for asking that. This is a doctrine and an understanding that is completely limited in the church. And it's a shame. Christ told us to love our enemies. Nowhere does he tell us that I know of to love his enemies. And we make a distinction throughout the scriptures between the enemies of God and Christ and our personal enemies. The Good Samaritan that helps him. He's helping him. He's not an enemy of Christ necessarily or an enemy of God. I think the key passage here, one of the key passages is Psalm 139. Let me just go there very quickly to answer this. I think Psalm 139 actually addresses this better than I can. So I'm just going to pretty much sort of read it. Psalm 139 ends with a wonderful poem in verses 23 and 24. We've written hymns on this, songs on it. We've put it on our greeting cards and put it on our plaques, perhaps even our glow-in-the-dark crosses, which is about the only thing you can buy at a Christian bookstore anymore. Don't go looking for a commentary or anything serious. You won't find it. Nothing wrong with glow-in-the-dark crosses if you have one. Look what it says. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxieties or my thoughts, and see if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Isn't that wonderful? Who can argue with that? It's great. Let's go backwards just a little bit. Verses 13 through 18 talks about how wonderful God is, what a great God he is. And he's great because he formed me, David says. Look at what he did. How precious also are your thoughts to me, O God, verse 17. How great is the sum of them. If I should count them, they would be more in number than the sand. And when I awake, I'm still with you. What a great and wonderful God he is. He has. Now, see watch what happens next in this psalm. He's talking about how great God is, and because God is so great, David is going to have a certain attitude towards those who hate God, hate this great God. He's going to have a view of them. You see, if our view of God is not that great, then those who hate him aren't really committing that much of an offense, are they? He's not that great. But David is talking about a great God here, and so now watch his attitude towards those who hate him. Verse 19. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. Depart from me, therefore, you bloodthirsty men. For they speak against you wickedly. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate them, O Lord, who hate you? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them my enemies. Then we have, back to the nice language again. Search me, O God. See, David really believes in a really seriously great God. And so when he says here, and I think this is the key passage here, I hate them, verse 22, with perfect hatred. I count them my enemies. He's saying, you know what? Before, if they weren't cursing God, they wouldn't be my enemies. But now, because they're cursing God, because they're God's enemies, now they're my enemies. But the guy who cuts me off in traffic, that I want to kill for just a minute, come on. We've all done it. We've wished an accident on the guy. We have. We've done it. Maybe not necessarily a fatality, but perhaps lose a couple of legs and an arm. Come on, we've all been there. We've done it. And we don't know what's with that guy. He might have just got a call that his wife had an accident. We don't know. We have no idea. Maybe he's just being a jerk. We don't know. But that guy is our enemy at that moment. Now, later on, we'll see him in a different context. He won't be our enemy, but he's our enemy then. And we've addressed before, and I'll just mention it briefly again. The guy here to talk about here is definitely Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. That weeping prophet who prayed imprecatory prayers against the enemies of God, who also became his enemies because he was so bound up with communicating God's truth to these people that anybody who stopped God's truth to these people was an enemy of God and an enemy of Jeremiah. There is much more teaching on this that can and should be done. But I think the scriptures throughout make a distinction between my personal enemies. I think one of the reasons, Bob, that we have this problem is because we've taken up the world's language here and the world's attitudes. You've heard all the time, oh, I don't hate anybody. I don't hate. See, I'm not a hater. That's why I wear my hat around that says I love haters. There's a time to hate. But the world's like, oh, I don't ever hate. And so we've, I think, taken that in the Christian church and said, well, I don't have any enemies. Oh, you see, I'm a great Christian. I don't have any enemies. You know, if we really were a great Christian, maybe we would have a few more enemies than what we have. Because we line up God's enemies as ours. But what we've done is we have said in our circles today, we've said, well, you know what? I don't have any enemies. I don't think God has any and since I love God, then he doesn't have any enemies either. We're just no enemies. But as we've pointed out from time to time before, there is enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. Remember that one? Genesis 3? Enmity means bitter hatred and feuding between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And I've mentioned before that on occasion, when I get into this type of a discussion, which isn't as often as I'd like, but I get into this type of discussion, I ask the question, when I say, hey, there's enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed or descendants of the woman. There's enmity between bitter hatred and feuding between the two. And I'll ask, who put that enmity there? And you know what I get? I'll even make it easy for him. Who put that enmity there? God or Satan? And you know what I usually get? You already know. Well, obviously Satan. Because there's enmity. But anybody who's read Genesis 3 knows Satan didn't put that enmity there. God did it. But it's a tough doctrine because we know from reading the scriptures that Jesus Christ will destroy his enemies. He will destroy those who hate him. So we'd rather just not even talk about those kinds of things. A lot more could be said about that. But the key is, throughout the scriptures, there's a difference between the enemies of Christ and my own personal enemies with which we have a disagreement on. And things get loud. We see this all the time in arguments. This is a great failure of me. A great failure. That I often am more upset that someone says something bad about me than if they say something bad about Christ. What a failure. I'm a lot more concerned about my enemies than I am about Christ's enemies. Not good. Does that help?
Well, yes. Just for my own clarification, there is a distinction of enemies. Enemies are divided into, if you want simplified, two different types.
No doubt about that, Bob. And again,
And-
Jeremiah is the guy, because he wept for the people, and yet against some people, he prayed curses down on their heads. Now, in our lack of understanding in our modern church today, how can you do both? It's one of the reasons why we don't study the Old Testament, because our ideas won't let us digest both.
Okay, so what do you do in the case of somebody that's an enemy, that's working against God's plan, that's part of your circle of influence?
Both.
Both.
Yeah. You pray against them that God would destroy their message, and if necessary, destroy them. No doubt. And if you need language to help you know exactly what to pray, there's plenty of options. It sounds unloving, but it's not. Question.
Could you comment on verse 12 where it says, "But then I shall know even as I am known"? So what I'd be curious of is, when he says am known, who's doing the knowing there? If it's God, that sounds kind of like an omniscient knowledge, which obviously can't be for us. So what does that mean?
Yeah, verse 12 here, back to 1 Corinthians 13. If this is the eternal state, how can it be that I will know even as also I am known? Meaning, if I know everything that God knows, I'd be God, right? We'll never know everything that God knows, ever. Being the eternal state for 1 billion years, you're not going to know what God knows. So how can it be here in 1 Corinthians 13, if what I'm saying is correct, that then I shall know even as also I am known? How can that be? Because you mean I'll know like God knows? And as I looked at this and thought about that question, if this is the eternal state, that word epigenosko that I mentioned earlier, Christ used that, for example, when he said the Father knows the Son in John. There is a difference, I would say, between a thorough knowledge and a complete knowledge. I'll give you an example. My wife and I know each other pretty well. I think it's safe to say that whenever a situation will come up, I pretty much know how she's going to react. I pretty much know. I think she pretty much knows how I'm going to react when something comes up. This happened, we know. Okay, but I don't know how many times her heart beats. I don't know how many synapses her brain fires every millisecond or minute in my case. I don't know that. I don't have complete knowledge, but I do have thorough knowledge. And I think what he's saying here is your knowledge is going to be that of a child to a man. Not even a man knows everything. I think that's the interpretive key right there. But the difference is going to be that great. It's not going to be complete in the sense of knowing everything, but it's going to be the difference between a child and a parent. And I think that's the interpretive key there for the knowledge that he's talking about. Good question. I thought that one might come up.
Comment and a question. The comment on what Conrad just asked.
Yes.
I think the key is that you're looking in a mirror, you're looking at yourself. When you're in the eternal state, you'll finally know yourself as Christ already knows you. You'll be transparent to yourself. You're looking in the mirror now trying to see yourself. You see it dimly. We know ourselves. We see our sins, we see what we're trying to do, but I think that when we're there, we'll finally know as Christ already knows us. So that would be my comment on that. My question is, in the previous verse, when I was a child, I spoke as a child, and as a man. in previous chapters, Paul has talked about grow up, get mature. Is there a possibility here that he's talking about simply maturing in the faith and towards love, but not necessarily talking about the eternal state in that passage?
Yes, certainly there's application there. I will tell you that before I studied this, I thought that was the extent of it, that he was back on his theme, and I've mentioned this theme before when I preached through this. This is a theme that he has come back to again and again. You are children. I'd like to speak to you like adults, but I have to speak to you like children. Before my study in this passage, I really felt that that was the primary emphasis. I'm going to use that term, not multiple interpretations here, but primary emphasis. I believe his primary emphasis is the state they are now in versus the eternal state. But there's a secondary emphasis, no doubt about it at all, that you guys are trying to show off with your gifts, and you're doing the whole thing wrong, and you're being like children, a bunch of show-offs. I do believe that's there because he just, that's been such a theme throughout. So I believe it's a second. What I've changed in my view of this is that that emphasis is going from a primary to a secondary emphasis for what he's trying to say. So I certainly believe it's there because he's just talked about it way too much. I have another question. Well, I certainly want to thank you. I want to thank you for your kind attention here this morning. Next week, we're going to talk about the temporary nature, if indeed it is temporary, of the spiritual gifts. Tongues cease, prophecy fail, knowledge vanish away. When? And that'll lead us into our next chapter.